Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 9, which is on Sub-Saharan Africa. So let's first pay a visit to the word cloud. A couple of the main themes that emerge relate first of all to the climate, and then second of all to poverty. So when you guys are thinking of Africa, you're thinking of a hot, dry place full of poor people, and more than that, you're also thinking a lot about the animals, the wildlife. I see giraffes in there. And this is really a fair indication of the way that Sub-Saharan Africa is portrayed in popular culture and popular media, probably, in the United States. So one of the first big misconceptions about Africa that deserves correcting, when you think of a map, and if you've got one on the wall, if you have one handy, depending on the kind of map that it is, it might be a Mercator projection, which was originally developed for the navigation of European sailors trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean. All of the longitude lines are straight, so the effect is that the land masses are stretched towards the poles and compressed towards the equator. And with one of these maps, incidentally, it puts England and Western Europe in the middle. With one of these maps, Africa looks like it's about the same size as Greenland, which of course is not true. So Africa is actually considerably larger than we realize. 3 of the continental US's could fit in Africa. And here's a visualization cramming a number of countries into the continent of Africa. So it's a lot bigger than we think of. The GDP of the entire continent is pushing $2 trillion. That is an infinitesimally small percentage of the world GDP. So we've looked at this map a couple of times this semester, and remember it's adjusted to show the size of a country based on the GDP. So we see Japan, really huge here in purple, China kind of growing, Western Europe really big in this reddish pink, the United States likewise in blue, Latin America very small, and Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, nearly disappears, with the possible exception here of South Africa. There are a billion people, more than a billion people, living on the continent, which comprises almost 15% of the total population of the world. So there's a lot of people in a lot of different countries, but not much wealth. Okay, so why are we talking about North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa separately? You'll remember that we talked about North Africa along with the Middle East a couple of weeks ago. There's a few reasons that this makes sense, and then there are also some counter-arguments, so I'll go over those now. Here's a great figure from the book, which is showing a lot of the geographic features of Sub-Saharan Africa. The major divider that we're talking about here, the reason why we're saying Sub-Saharan, literally because we're talking about Africa below the Sahara Desert. You can pick it out pretty easily in this satellite image right here. So this is the physical barrier that we're thinking of when we divide North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa. Now there's also a big cultural, social separation in terms of religion and also linguistically. This is also a map you've seen before, again, when we were doing the Middle East and North Africa unit. And you can see that by percentage of Muslim population, this whole part of the world fits together rather nicely. And then we see again the Sahara Desert as a divider. We see a different trend south of the Sahara, or in Sub-Saharan Africa. Politically, North Africa interacts more with Southwest Asia, aka the Middle East and Europe, especially in the migrant crisis. So when we're talking about some of the major sources of the current migration crisis in Europe, one of the biggest donor countries, so to speak, in terms of people leaving there is Eritrea. So there are a lot more flows of people kind of, do you see where my mouse is now? Going from North Africa, Southwest Asia, and Europe. There's a lot more interaction there between these areas than there is between Sub-Saharan Africa and those areas. And also, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa experienced different levels and different types of colonization, which has a lot to do with which countries were the colonizers. The countries had different styles of colonial oversight, and I'll go into greater detail on that in a moment. On the other hand, there are some legitimate reasons why maybe we should be discussing Africa as a continent, as an entire continent, rather than saying North Africa and the Middle East and then Sub-Saharan Africa. So although we have the Sahara Desert, we also have the Nile River linking North Africa to the center of the continent. And then when it comes to certain political organizations, like the AU, the African Union, there's no division going on. So there are arguments in favor of both ways. For the purposes of our course, it makes more sense analytically to look at Sub-Saharan Africa on its own, but there are also a lot of arguments in favor of overall African integrity. All right, let's think about Africa before colonization. It had extremely complex, advanced societies, probably much more complex than a lot of students would realize. So some examples of this would be, we've got architecture here, but we also have evidence of extensive irrigation systems, writing, culture. There were very large, for the time, very large urban areas, and these urban areas, especially near coasts and then inland in the Nile Valley, because the Nile River goes very far inland, and civilization tends to show up where there's water and agriculture is a possibility. There were very distinct kingdoms, empires, cultures with a lot of trade going on between them, a lot of agriculture, a lot of mineral wealth. So there was a very sophisticated society. And obviously, with the interruption of colonization, but a lot of this is still evident today. This shows the geographical extent of some of the early and later kingdoms. So we see a succession in West Africa of different kingdoms. And then I want to draw your attention here to Ethiopia. Ethiopia, although it was occupied in Italy between 1936 and 1941, it has the interesting distinction of, in Sub-Saharan Africa, being the country that was never under direct colonial rule. So bear that in mind for later on. When you think about present-day Sub-Saharan Africa, on one hand, we need to be thinking about the pre-colonial baseline, but then also the colonial experience itself. So where did these countries, actually it's not even fair to call them countries yet, but where did these societies, where did these civilizations, where were they pre-colonialism? What kind of colonial experience did they have? And again, we'll go into that in greater detail soon. And in Ethiopia's case, it's exceptional in that it resisted successfully colonial interference. And then how does that translate to the present day? But before we go into that, it's just really important to understand the level of historical, linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity that exists in Sub-Saharan Africa. Probably one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking things about representations of Africa in popular media, but also just from talking to people, you will probably get a sense of this, is a lot of people, frighteningly, think it's a country, the whole continent, or don't understand the level of diversity that exists. So at least as much as Western Europe. You wouldn't confuse France and Italy, but you would very unfortunately very easily confuse Ghana and Ethiopia. Very early, the first sustained trade, scholars think, between Western Europe and Africa was initiated by the Portuguese, and then all the other European powers got in on this trade by the 1600s. Mostly because of the nature of the trade. This was maritime trade. This was focused in coastal cities. And the Europeans were looking for resources. They were looking for gold, ivory, slaves. And they were also looking for a water route to Asia. So, of course, now we have the Suez Canal, but that was constructed. They were trying to figure out a way of getting there without having to go around the Horn of Africa. Slavery became a major part of this as early as 1530, and by 1700, there were 50,000 slaves a year. Again, these are people being basically forcibly kidnapped from this continent, never to go home again. And we need to think of it both in terms of those individuals and the injustices that they faced as forced slave laborers, but also think of the effect on the society which they were leaving behind, which was being depleted of strong young males for the most part. Europe got more and more interested in Africa as it needed more and more resources to feed the Industrial Revolution. And this is where we get a lot of the early representations of Africa as a continent, sort of the romanticized, but also very partial, very racist accounts of Africa as this dark, wild, almost mythical place. And geography as a discipline was very much complicit in this at the time, in putting forward these very Eurocentric, romanticized accounts of the dark continent. And all of this fed into justification for the colonial project, which was both a search for resources, for raw materials, and also for people to convert. Now, with all of the major European powers basically sending explorers, sending expeditions to Africa, trying to claim different parts, the so-called Scramble for Africa, they sat down at a conference in Berlin, and you'll remember a very similar thing happened with the Middle East. We were talking about that shortly ago, the 1916 conference with England, France, and Russia, where they were divvying up zones of influence in the Middle East. So earlier, they did the same thing with Africa. And you can see here, this is from the book, a map of the different zones that were controlled by the different countries. And it's important, this is another reason for thinking about the divide between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, because French colonialism operated very differently from British colonialism, Belgian colonialism. But this map was drawn basically by saying what part would you like? What are you willing to trade for? Okay, let's draw a straight line from this part to Lake Chad. Let's draw a straight line from this mountain range to the ocean. Germany will get that. Britain will get that. In fact, there were a few instances of monarchs liking a particular landmark, and so the diplomats said, okay, we'll trade you that if we can have this lake, if we can have this mountain. It was not done with a sense of saying, where are the cultures, where are the language zones, let's make sure that we're creating areas that have relatively homogeneous groups of people, or or following any kind of pre-colonial boundaries. That was basically ignored. So it divided cultural and linguistic groups. It ripped apart previously unified cultural and linguistic zones. And so when you draw the borders arbitrarily like that, what you get are societies where there are groups that were traditionally hostile to one another, now all within one border. And so when these borders were put on the map, and eventually in the post-colonial era, it was basically setting up a lot of failures that have continued to plague the continent to this day. All right, I mentioned that different colonizers had a different approach to colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa. So Great Britain took an approach of indirect rule, where they tried to leave indigenous power structures in place, not because they were feeling nice or magnanimous, but because they basically it was easier for them. To oversimplify matters, looking from the bottom up, if regular people would see as their rulers indigenous, local rulers, they would be easier to control, this was the British perspective, than if they were able to see who was really in charge. So the local rulers, in actuality, answered to the British. Were not really empowered to act of their own accord. But to their subjects, it may have seemed as though the local rulers were in charge. And this is a strategy that the British used in other parts of the world as well, and we'll talk about them in other units. France, on the other hand, remember, they were mostly in charge of North Africa, took an assimilationist approach, where basically they were saying, you are now part of the French Empire, and wanted to spread French culture, French language, through law, education, dress, basically saying, you need to be as French as possible, and we'll help you be as French as possible. So it's another kind of approach, with a different set of effects later on. Then there were countries that took direct rule. So Portugal and Belgium were both particularly brutal, especially Belgium. King Leopold of Belgium basically ruled Rwanda as a personal fief, and thought of all of the labor and all of the resources there as personally belonging to him. And there are some seriously abhorrent. There's a history of seriously abhorrent human rights abuses that I encourage you to learn more about. But the countries that were under direct rule included Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, Rwanda, Zaire, and Burundi. And this was a very, very paternalistic, direct, and a very harsh way of ruling. So think of the pre-colonial era, and think of all of the different networks of trade that existed between regions that had been coalescing over centuries, over millennia, around language and culture, especially along rivers, and within certain zones of influence. The colonial powers were not interested in developing the continent per se, in the sense of increasing trade within the continent. The colonial powers were focused on extracting as many raw resources, using as much cheap forced labor as possible, as quickly as possible, getting it back to the colony, back to the home country. And how do you do that? You get it to the coast as fast as you can. You put it on a ship and you sail it home. And so that is why we see these railroad networks. So one of the biggest myths about colonialism is, the colonizers, they just wanted to help the colonized people. They built all of this infrastructure. Look, they built sewers, they built railroads. The railroads were not built by the British thinking, how can we help people in Ghana get around in a way that makes sense to them? How can we get West Africa more connected to itself? You'll notice that they all go from the interior to the coast. They were simply a way of getting wealth in the form of raw material as quickly as possible to the coast and back to the colonizing country, resulting in networks, geared for export, but with weak internal linkages. So, do you see where my mouse is? Imagine trying to get from here to here. The fastest way would be to take a train to the coast, hop on a ship, and then take another train back to the interior, going a much longer distance. So anyone who says, the rail networks were so great, the colonizers were doing them a favor, you can explain this map to them. And so because this network of extraction was so efficiently constructed, it resulted in a very rapid redistribution of wealth, basically being sucked out of Sub-Saharan Africa and taken to the colonizers' home countries. Another, even an equally perverse part of this outcome was that then those raw materials were manufactured in the colonizing country and resold as finished products to whoever still had any money left in the colonized countries. And this really shook up the traditional system of how land was controlled, and also, as I mentioned before, the borders. All right, agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa varies a lot by region. Basically, there's not that much arable land. And so you see here, this is a great image showing the intensity of agriculture, because when there's not much arable land, what arable land there is used very efficiently. You're not going to find land that can grow stuff not growing stuff. Cultivation, because there's not much arable land, also moves around. So slash and burn basically refers to a practice of clearing agricultural land by burning whatever brush is there or forest that puts nutrients in the soil in the short term, but it's only a short-term thing. That land can't sustain agriculture for a long period of time, and so people then have to move on. Then other forms of agriculture include floodplain farming. And here we have think about the seasonality. So during the dry season, a river might be completely dry or just a creek. But then during the rainy season, it will spread out. It will maybe be several kilometers wide. And so during that part of the year, it can be good agricultural land when there's plenty of moisture. And then finally, pastoralism. So this is people with herds of animals, again, moving in these seasonal rhythms, following the moisture where it's available, when it's available. 10% of the land in Africa is under some kind of environmental protection, about half of which is a park or animal preserve. You'll see a lot in the news, including lately Cecil the lion, but you'll see a lot in the news about poaching. And this is big business. A lot of the ivory is going to places now like China, a fair amount to the United States illegally. But lots of species are being hunted to deep threat or even to extinction. But I don't want you to think about poaching just in terms of the effect on animals. Think of who's doing the poaching, what that says about local security, where the money from the poaching is going, what it's being used for. And so in a lot of cases, this is a huge governance challenge for countries, because criminal syndicates are carrying out this poaching, which again, the outside world isn't doing a great job of doing its part to combat. Controls on ivory are not great, especially in East Asia. And so it's really difficult for a lot of countries to maintain control of these animal preserves. And in some cases, wildlife conservation is helping to preserve either an animal population or an ecosystem, but there are some protected areas that have basically been depleted. The Sahara Desert is growing in a lot of places. Here is a map showing areas where the desert may expand. From 1968 to 1973, there was a drought and an associated famine. So the drought being the lack of rainfall, the lack of water, and then the famine being the effect on humans. There are a lot of efforts right now. So a notable one that comes to mind is the NGO of Wangari Maathai to reforest areas where there had been deforestation, which makes land more susceptible to desertification. So basically the idea of building a great green wall to halt the advancing Sahara Desert. Sub-Saharan Africa has a very high fertility rate, and this is something that you would expect to see given the economic situation. On average, about a third of people live in cities, and then when you have a high fertility rate, what that means is that your overall population is very, very young. Now, part of that is also because a lot of people haven't been reaching old age due to disease. All right, thinking about kind of zooming out and thinking about regions within Sub-Saharan Africa, first of all, no one should ever think about Africa as one country. But if you need to zoom out a little bit, then think about West Africa, the Horn of Africa, Equatorial Africa, so where's the equator, and East Africa. And you can group these regions both in terms of physical and cultural geography. So looking at religion, looking at language, but then also looking at climate zones. But again, as we talked about before, within those regions, there's a lot of mixed colonial legacies. So you have Ghana colonized by the British right next to La Côte d'Ivoire. Here are some of the major landforms in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we've got these basins, including some areas, you can look for this color, below sea level, but these basins are very, very low. And then coastal highlands. And of course the Sahara. And then when you're thinking about pre-colonial networks of movement of people and goods, look first to the rivers. Because a lot of the early civilizations and the kingdoms, empires that existed were being formed around either on the coasts or around lakes and rivers. The physical geography of Sub-Saharan Africa includes a fault zone and some very beautiful landforms that result. So the Great Rift Valley and Victoria Falls. And This site specifically is where a lot of really great archaeology is happening, where they keep finding, it seems, new hominids. So more and more links in the ancestry of humans. And of course, this is the region, this is the area from which we evolved. So that's why this part of Africa is thought of as the cradle of humanity. This is where all of our hominid ancestors evolved and lived, and us as well. Here's a map showing the mineral resources of Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, this is what a lot of the colonizers were after in the scramble for Africa. All of this stuff to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And again, it's important to think when you have only 30% arable land. If you're wanting to study people, then think about water. Right now, especially groups like the World Bank are putting forward proposals involving hydroelectricity in Africa. In a lot of cases, this has a lot more to do with economics and extraction than it has to do with providing electricity for people. So there have been some really inspiring stories lately about the potential for solar and wind power, including basically homemade technology that can get energy to people. But for industrial purposes, for mines, for then processing that ore, for smelting it, you would need greater energy density, and so that's where hydroelectricity comes in. Here we see the ranges of major diseases and the vectors that spread them. Malaria being, of course, one of the main and worst culprits, with really quite horrible, very difficult to avoid, very bad symptoms, spread easily by mosquitoes. So just to conclude and recap a little bit, when you think about Sub-Saharan Africa, remember that this is where humans evolved 2 million years ago. Think also about the fact that for the past several thousand years, there have been complex societies with diverse religion, culture, and language families going back thousands of years, and well-developed for the time economies, major cities, concentrations of people, which is a major driver for creation of culture. 500 years ago is when this extremely violent history of colonialism began, of European domination. And only since the second half of the 20th century have sub-Saharan African countries been emerging from European domination, becoming independent. But there's a lot to be said for development, for instance, as neocolonialism. So even if colonies no longer formally exist, Europe and the West, the United States, are still very closely economically involved in sub-Saharan Africa in ways that many would argue are still very exploitative. So it's probably a long journey ahead, but when you're thinking about a lot of the problems that are facing sub-Saharan African today, I hope that you'll be able to understand some of the origins of those problems in the continent's colonial past. And I encourage you to do more research on your own to understand this more deeply. There's a lot of really, really important, sometimes very sad even horrifying, but very important stories in individual countries and individual regions that I think you would find very interesting. So I mentioned King Leopold of Belgium. I would also point to the Rwandan genocide, which a lot of Westerners understand as this crazy conflict between different ethnic groups, but has a lot of links back to the colonial rule of that area. So again, I hope that this has helps you understand those processes a little bit better. Thank you for listening. Please, please, please reach out with any questions for greater detail. And as always, the lectures are just a starting point. Make sure that you're doing your reading. Make sure you're reviewing the slides and also doing the other activities in the module. All right, take care.